The sun had not yet breached the jagged spine of the Blue Ridge Mountains, but Jack Reynolds was already awake. He moved with the quiet economy of a man long accustomed to solitude, his bare feet making no sound on the cool, worn floorboards of the cabin. The mountain air, crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth, seeped through the window. He always left cracked open, a silent testament to a vigilance that never truly slept. Jack was a man carved from the very highlands he inhabited. At 42, he had the lean, hard-muscled frame that years of military service had built and a life of manual labor had maintained. His short brown hair was trimmed with disciplined precision, though strands of silver now staked their claim at his temples, a quiet map of the years since he had left the world behind. His face was a study in contradictions. The sharp line of his jaw and the weathered texture of his skin spoke of hardship, yet his eyes, a deep and thoughtful gray, held a profound and weary kindness. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and felt too deeply. His routine was a ritual, a bulwark against the chaos that churned just beneath the surface of his calm. Coffee first black and strong brewed in an old percolator on the gas stove. He stood by the large window in the main room, sipping the hot liquid as the sky slowly bled from inky black to a soft, bruised purple. He watched the forest wake up, the birds beginning their chorus, a deer, and its fawn stepping delicately through the morning mist. The MK-23 SOCOM pistol rested in its holster at his hip, its weight familiar against his side. The 12-caliber sidearm with its custom threaded barrel and tactical trigger job was more than a weapon. It was an extension of himself, a companion that never left his side when he stepped outside. He'd modified it himself, adjusting the pull to exactly 4 pounds of pressure, adding tritium night sights that glowed a soft green in darkness. Like everything in Jack's life now, it served a purpose: clean, efficient, reliable. This place was both his sanctuary and his prison. From this vantage point, the world was a masterpiece of silent, indifferent beauty. Endless waves of forested peaks rolled into the distance, their slopes a tapestry of green and granite. The cabin, which he had built with his own hands, was perched on a high bluff, a solitary outpost against the vastness of the sky and the ancient wilderness. He had come here 6 years ago after the accident. In the rainy autumn of 2019, he had come here to bury the man he used to be, the husband of Rebecca, the father of Sophia. But ghosts did not care for geography. They had followed him up the winding mountain roads, settling into the quiet corners of the cabin, their whispers carried on the wind that sighed through the towering hemlocks. After his coffee, Jack began his patrol. He pulled on a faded gray t-shirt, a worn flannel shirt in shades of navy and beige left unbuttoned, and a pair of denim jeans softened by years of wear. His feet found their home in a pair of sturdy combat boots, the same model he'd worn in another life, when he'd carried a different name, Lieutenant Reynolds, Navy SEAL Team 6 combat medic. He walked the perimeter of his property, his steps measured, his senses on high alert. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was simply obeying a command from a part of his mind that still stood on guard duty, a lonely sentry watching over a life that had already been lost. The memories came in flashes, sharp and unwelcome as shards of glass. The slick blacktop of the road gleaming under the streetlights, the squeal of tires that he could still hear in the dead of night, the impossible final silence. He would stop walking, his hand tightening on the grip of his pistol, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle would tick beneath his skin. He would force himself to breathe, to focus on the world in front of him, the texture of bark on an old oak, the call of a distant hawk, the feeling of the solid ground beneath his boots. He would cage the memories, lock them away again in the dark, but he knew they were always there waiting. This land in its rugged splendor was the only thing vast enough to contain his grief. He had chosen it for its isolation, for its silence that allowed him to hear nothing but the beating of his own broken heart. It was a place where no one could reach him, where no unexpected phone calls or well-meaning visitors could pierce the armor he had built around himself. It was a good place to disappear, to become a ghost among the peaks. But sometimes when the loneliness grew too sharp, he understood that this beautiful wild place was not a refuge. It was a tomb, and he was its willing caretaker. In his combat journal, a thick leather-bound book with water-resistant pages, Jack documented each day with military precision. Not just the weather and wildlife sightings, but ammunition counts, perimeter status, and equipment maintenance. The journal was both tactical log and therapy, a tangible record proving he still existed in a world that had moved on without him. That afternoon, the sky began to change. The clear, bright blue of the morning curdled into a bruised, heavy gray. The wind picked up its mournful sigh, turning into a restless howl that whipped through the trees, tearing at their leaves. Jack watched the storm roll in from his porch, his chair creaking rhythmically. Storms didn't bother him. He respected their power, their raw and honest fury. It was a language he understood. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, he moved inside, securing the windows and door. The rain quickly became a deluge, lashing against the cabin in violent sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, a deafening explosion that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. Lightning bleached the world white for a split second, illuminating the thrashing trees and the chaos of the storm. He was stoking the fire in the stone hearth, the crackle of the flames a small comfort against the roar of the tempest, when he heard it a sound that did not belong. It was not the crash of thunder or the groan of a tree branch. It was a heavy, desperate thud against his front door. Jack froze, every instinct honed by years of training, snapping to attention. He straightened up slowly, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. No one came to this cabin. No one. A hunter, perhaps lost in the storm. Unlikely. Any local knew better than to be caught out on these ridges in weather like this. Another thud, weaker this time, followed by what sounded like a low whine almost swallowed by the wind. It was an animal. Relief warred with caution. He moved to the door, his steps silent, and peered through the small peephole. All he could see was a wall of driving rain and darkness. He undid the heavy deadbolt, his pistol now drawn, and held low at his side. He opened the door a few inches, the wind tearing it from his grasp and slamming it open against the interior wall. And there, collapsed on his doorstep, was a creature of shadow and storm. It was a German shepherd, massive and powerfully built. Its thick coat a rare and beautiful mix of slate gray and startling white fur. The dog was soaked, its fur matted with mud, and something darker that Jack knew was not rain. It lay on its side, breathing in shallow, ragged pants. Its eyes were open, intelligent, and amber-colored, and they were fixed on him with a look of desperate, fading urgency. Along its flank, just below the rib cage, a dark patch of fur was unnaturally wet, the unmistakable sign of a gunshot wound. Jack's trained eye immediately identified the caliber and weapon, 7.62 millimeter, likely from a suppressed Remington MSR, a sniper's tool, not a hunter's weapon. The wound pattern showed it was a deliberate shot, not a stray bullet. Someone had tried to kill this animal with professional precision. The magnificent animal let out one last soft cry before its head fell limp against the wet wood of the porch. For a man who had spent 6 years shutting the world out, the act of dragging it inside was a brutal physical shock. The German shepherd was a dead weight, 100 pounds of unconscious muscle and wet fur. Jack gritted his teeth, his own muscles straining as he pulled the animal over the threshold and slammed the door against the storm's fury. The sudden quiet in the cabin was heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of the hearth, the howl of the wind outside, and the shallow, labored breathing of the dog. Jack was no stranger to triage. He had performed it under far worse conditions in the dust and chaos of places he tried not to remember. His training took over a familiar and cold comfort. He laid an old wool blanket on the floorboards before the fire and carefully rolled the dog onto it. The firelight flickered across the animal's gray and white coat, revealing the true extent of the wound. It was a clean entry, but the exit was ragged, and the breed had lost a significant amount of blood. "Let's see what we're dealing with," Jack murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He retrieved his medical kit from a large footlocker at the end of his bed. It was military issue, meticulously maintained. Inside, sterile instruments lay in perfect order alongside battlefield hemostatic agents that could stop arterial bleeding in seconds, tools no civilian would possess. He worked with a focused intensity, the rest of the world fading away until it was just him, the bone, and the wound. He cleaned the area with antiseptic, his touch surprisingly gentle. The dog didn't stir, lost in a deep state of the shock. As he irrigated the exit wound, his fingers brushed against something hard lodged beneath the skin, a fragment. He worked carefully with a pair of forceps, probing the torn tissue. A few moments later, he pulled it free. It was a piece of deformed metal, the jacket peeled back from the lid core. He dropped it into a small metal bowl, where it made a sharp clinking sound. He knew ballistics. This was no hunting round. It was a 7.62 millimeter rifle bullet, the kind favored for its low report, often paired with a suppressor. It was a round designed for quiet, efficient killing, not for taking down game. A cold knot of suspicion tightened in his gut. This was not a lost dog accidentally shot by a poacher. This was something else entirely. This was deliberate. He finished dressing the wound, wrapping the dog's torso with clean bandages. He administered a broad-spectrum antibiotic from his own supply and set up a slow drip of saline to combat the dehydration and shock. As he worked, he studied the animal. It was in prime condition, no older than 4 or 5, its muscles well-defined, its teeth clean, its coat thick, and cared for despite the current state. This was not a stray. This dog had a home, a purpose. It had the calm, confident bearing of a creature that knew its own strength. Even unconscious, it projected an aura of unwavering resilience. "You're a tough one," Jack said more to himself than to the dog. "Like a ghost." The name settled in his mind as if it had always been there. Ghost. With the immediate medical crisis handled, Jack's professional vigilance fully awakened. He let his eyes roam over the dog again, looking for anything else out of place. His gaze fell on the collar. It was thick, made of high-quality black nylon with a sturdy metal buckle, not the kind of thing you buy at a chain pet store. It was tactical grade, the sort used by military working dogs. Jack ran his fingers along it, feeling the texture. Underneath the main strap in the padded section designed for comfort, his thumb detected a small hard lump that didn't belong. The positioning was deliberate, designed to be concealed from casual inspection, but accessible to someone who knew where to look. Jack recognized the design immediately. It was a modified version of a dead drop technique used by his SEAL team for emergency exfiltration communications, a method to transfer critical intelligence when digital channels were compromised. Only someone with special operations training would know this protocol. He retrieved a small utility knife from his pocket. With surgical precision, he sliced through the heavy stitching of the collar's lining. He pulled the fabric back and found a tiny sealed plastic pouch nestled within the padding. Inside the pouch was a single object, a matte black USB drive, small and ruggedized, designed to withstand extreme conditions. Jack stared at it, the small device resting in the palm of his hand. The cold knot of suspicion in his stomach solidified into a certainty as hard and heavy as granite. This was no accident. The dog was not a victim. He was a messenger. And the message he carried was important enough for someone to try to kill him over. Jack looked from the drive to the Mao whose life now seemed inextricably linked to his own. The quiet, empty fortress he had built for himself had just been breached by a silent courier. He spent the next few hours watching over his patient. The storm outside eventually exhausted its fury, the thunder receding into a distant grumble, the rain softening to a steady drizzle. Inside, the only sounds were the fire and Ghost's breathing, which was slowly growing deeper and more regular. Around midnight, the dog stirred. Its amber eyes fluttered open, hazy at first, then sharpening with a startling intelligence. It tried to lift its head, then whimpered softly as the pain in its side flared. "Easy now," Jack said, his voice low and calm. He held out a bowl of fresh water. Ghost lapped at it eagerly, his thirst immense. When he was done, he looked at Jack, not with the fear of a wild animal, but with a clear, assessing gaze. There was a moment of silent communication, a mutual understanding that passed between the wounded soldier and the wounded animal. After another hour of rest, Ghost struggled to his feet. He was unsteady, his legs trembling with weakness, but he was resolute. He took a few steps, testing his balance, then he walked directly to Jack, who was sitting in his armchair, and nudged his hand with his wet nose. It was a gentle but firm gesture. When he had Jack's attention, he turned, walked to the front door, and stood before it, looking back over his shoulder. He let out a low whine, a sound filled not with pain, but with a profound, undeniable urgency. The message was perfectly clear. "It's time to go." Jack looked at the pointy standing sentinel by the door. He looked at the small USB drive, now sitting on the table beside him. He could ignore it. He could tend to the dog until it was healed and then let it go on its way. He could bolt the door, reinforce his walls, and sink back into the quiet oblivion he had chosen. It would be the safe thing to do, the sensible thing, but as he looked into the dog's intelligent, pleading eyes, he saw a reflection of a duty he thought he had buried long ago. The man who followed orders, the man who ran toward trouble, not away from it, was still in there. He had tried to silence him, but he had never truly killed him. With a deep sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 6 years of solitude, Jack Reynolds stood up. He walked to the footlocker, the one that held more than just medical supplies. He pulled out a tactical backpack, a GPS unit, and a customized M4A1 rifle with an ACOG scope and suppressor attached. The weapon was clean oiled, maintained with the same obsessive care as everything else in his possession. He checked the action, loaded a magazine, and slung it over his shoulder. From a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, he retrieved additional magazines, each loaded with 5.56mm NATO rounds military-grade ammunition that would drop a man at 500 yards. He added his K-bar combat knife to his belt opposite his pistol. The 7-inch blade had saved his life more times than he could count in another world. He packed his medical kit, water purification tablets, 3 days' worth of high-calorie ration bars, a thermal blanket, and his hardened laptop. The ghost of the mountain was about to walk back into the world, and he would not be walking alone. Dawn broke over a world washed clean. The air, stripped of humidity by the storm, was sharp and cool in Jack Reynolds' lungs. Mist clung to the hollows of the mountains, ghostly white against the deep green of the pines. Armed and packed, he stood on his porch and looked at his guide. Ghost was waiting, his posture alert, the bandages around his torso clean, but Jack knew the dog was in pain. Yet there was no hesitation in his amber eyes, only a focused, driving purpose. He gave a single low woof, as if to say, "The trail is already getting cold." Jack nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their shared mission. He locked the cabin door, a place that had been his entire world for 6 years, and stepped back into the life he had tried so hard to outrun. They moved through the forest with deliberate care. Jack chose their path strategically, using natural features to minimize their trail. He stepped on rocks instead of soft earth, crossed streams to break their scent trail, and avoided brushing against vegetation that would reveal their passage. No electronic GPS for this journey. Jack navigated by the sun and the natural features of the land, the way he'd been taught in SEER training. Electronic signals could be tracked. The mountain's geography could not. The journey was grueling. The storm had left the forest floor a treacherous landscape of slick, mud-fallen branches and swollen, fast-moving creeks. Ghost led them on a path that no human would have chosen, a direct and difficult route that cut through dense thickets and up steep, rocky inclines. The dog moved with an incredible, intelligent resolve. He would pause at forks in the barely there trail, sniff the air, and then choose a direction with unwavering confidence. He never looked back to see if Jack was following. He simply knew. Several times they had to stop so Jack could check Ghost's wound and give him water. The dog accepted the care with a quiet patience, but as soon as Jack was done, he would be on his feet again, eager to continue. A deep, unspoken respect grew between them. Jack recognized the heart of a good soldier in this animal, disciplined, determined, and utterly loyal to his task. After nearly 3 hours of hard trekking, Ghost slowed. They were on a high ridge overlooking a small, secluded valley. The dog let out a low whine and nudged Jack's leg, his gaze fixed on a point below. Jack lifted his binoculars. Nestled in a clearing, half swallowed by overgrown rhododendrons, was a dilapidated structure, an old ranger station long since abandoned by the Park Service. Its paint was peeling and a shutter hung crookedly from a single hinge. It looked like a place the world had forgotten. It was the perfect place to hide. Jack approached the station with the caution of a man walking into an ambush. He left Ghost hidden in the tree line, a silent command passing between them, and circled the building. There were no fresh tracks, but his instincts told him the place was not empty. The air was still heavy with a feeling of tense, frightened waiting. He found a back window that had been pried open. It was the only viable entry point besides the barricaded front door. He slipped through the window, landing in a crouch on the dusty floor inside. The station was dark, smelling of mildew and decay. He moved through the rooms like a wraith, his rifle held at the ready. In the main office, he found signs of recent occupation. Empty water bottles, a few discarded food wrappers, and a small threadbare blanket. He heard a faint rustle from a back storage room. He approached the door, his heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. He pushed it open. Huddled in the far corner were a woman and a young boy. The woman looked up, her eyes wide with terror in the dim light. She was in her late 30s with dark, tangled hair, framing a face that was gaunt with exhaustion and fear. She wore practical hiking clothes that were now torn and mud-stained. In her hands, she clutched a heavy iron tire iron, holding it like a weapon. Shielded behind her was a small boy, no older than 8, with wide dark eyes that seemed to see nothing at all. He clung to his mother's leg, a silent ghost-like figure. "Don't come any closer," the woman warned, her voice a harsh, desperate whisper. Jack held up his free hand, keeping the rifle pointed at the floor. "I'm not going to hurt you. The dog led me here." At the mention of the dying, a flicker of something hope perhaps crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by suspicion. "Who are you?" He took a half step into the room, allowing a sliver of light from a grimy window to fall across his features. The woman's breath hitched. Her eyes darted from his face to some point in her memory and back again. The tire iron lowered slightly. "I've seen you," she stammered. "In a photograph on Daniel's desk." She took a shaky breath, her voice cracking as she spoke the name. "You're Jack Reynolds." The name of her husband hit Jack with the force of a physical blow. Daniel Mitchell. The name echoed there from a lifetime ago, from a world of sand and sweat and brotherhood forged in fire. Daniel, his teammate in the SEALs, the man who had been the closest thing to a brother he'd ever had, the man he hadn't spoken to in nearly 7 years. "You're Lisa?" he asked, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. She nodded, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her dirt-streaked cheeks. The tire iron fell to the floor with a loud clang. "He's gone, Jack," she sobbed, her body racked with grief. "They killed him." He moved forward, then his own loss, a fresh open wound in his chest. He helped her to a sitting position on an overturned crate. The boy Tyler never made a sound. He simply watched, his expression chillingly blank. In hushed, frantic tones, Lisa told him everything. Daniel had become an investigative journalist after leaving the service. He had uncovered something massive, a criminal enterprise run by Maxwell Reed, a powerful tech billionaire whose logistics software managed shipping across 43 countries. Behind the veneer of innovation and philanthropy, Reed was operating a sophisticated human trafficking network, moving people like cargo through his global supply chain. Daniel had been preparing to publish when the trap was sprung. They were ambushed on a remote road 2 days ago. "Daniel knew this might happen," she explained, her voice trembling. "He had a contingency plan, a last resort. He told me if the worst happened, he would get Ghost to you. He said you were the only one he could trust." She described their last moments together. Daniel fighting back, creating a diversion. He had pushed the USB into Ghost's collar, opened the door, and given his final command, "Find Reynolds, go." He had saved them, sacrificing himself so they could run. Jack looked at the small, silent boy who was now staring at the floor. "Tyler," he began softly. Lisa's expression crumpled. "He saw it, Jack. He saw everything. He hasn't said a word since. Not one word." Jack felt the air leave his lungs. He understood that kind of silence. He understood the kind of trauma that steals your voice. He looked at this broken family, refugees from a war he didn't even know was being fought, and saw the echoes of his own shattered life. The quiet mountain had not been a sanctuary. It had only been a place to wait. And now the war had come to find him. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, tense procession. Jack led the way, his rifle held in a low-ready position, his senses sweeping the forest around them. Behind him, Lisa followed, her hand resting on Tyler's shoulder. The boy walked with the numb, shuffling steps of a sleepwalker, his eyes fixed on the ground. Bringing up the rear was Ghost, his movements stiff with pain, but his head constantly swiveling, scanning their back trail with a low, rumbling growl that vibrated deep in his chest. They were a company of the wounded, a small broken unit retreating to the only defensible position they had. When they reached the cabin, Jack saw it through new eyes. For 6 years, it had been a fortress of solitude, its sturdy log walls meant to keep the world out. Now it had to be a sanctuary, a place to keep the danger at bay. Inside, the warmth of the hearth greeted them. He saw Lisa visibly relax, the rigid lines of fear around her eyes softening just a fraction. She guided Tyler to the worn armchair by the fire, and the boy sank into it, his small frame looking lost in the large piece of furniture. Jack put a fresh log on the fire, the crackle and pop, a comforting sound in the heavy silence. "Get some rest," he told Lisa, his voice low. "You're safe here, for now." But rest was a luxury none of them could afford. While Lisa made a simple meal from his supplies, Jack turned his attention to the object that had started it all, the small, black USB drive. He retrieved an old, ruggedized laptop from his footlocker. It was a relic completely offline, a machine he kept for one purpose: to access digital information without connecting to any network. He powered it on the screen, glowing to life in the dim cabin. He inserted the drive. A single password-protected icon appeared on the screen. He clicked on it, and a simple dialog box materialized: enter passphrase. For the next hour, Jack worked with a silent, focused frustration. He ran every basic decryption program in his old toolkit. He tried to bypass the security wall with backdoors he had learned in the service. He attempted to brute force the password with every combination of names, dates, and numbers he could associate with Daniel Mitchell. The result was always the same: access denied. The encryption was military grade, a digital fortress as formidable as the mountain itself. The answers were all right there, a ghost in the machine, but he had no way to make it speak. He finally pushed the laptop away, leaning back in his chair and running a hand over his tired face. It was useless. Lisa approached, placing a steaming mug of coffee on the table beside him. She had watched him work, her expression a mixture of hope and dread. "Nothing?" she asked softly. "It's locked down tight," Jack admitted. "Daniel didn't want anyone getting in. The problem is that includes us." She sank into the chair opposite him, her hands wrapped around her own mug for warmth. He was so careful. He knew who he was dealing with. She looked up, her eyes dark with the memory. "His name is Maxwell Reed." Jack listened as she painted a portrait of their enemy. Maxwell Reed was not some back-alley crime lord. He was a celebrated tech billionaire, a charismatic philanthropist whose face was on the cover of magazines. He preached about connecting the world and building a better future, and the public adored him. But behind the curtain of his pristine public image, he was a predator. Daniel had discovered that Reed's revolutionary logistics software, the program that ran his global shipping empire, had a hidden, darker purpose. It was the operational backbone for a sophisticated human trafficking network. "He's not just a criminal," Jack, Lisa said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "He's a sociopath. He's brilliant, charming, and utterly convinced that he is above any law." Daniel said the most dangerous thing about him was his arrogance. He believes he is so much smarter than everyone else that he can hide his crimes in plain sight. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. It was a type of enemy he knew well, the true believer, utterly convinced of his own infallibility. "An army of one is still just one man," Jack said. "He doesn't do the dirty work himself, no." Lisa whispered, her gaze dropping to the floor. "For that, he has Viper." She described the man who was Maxwell Reed's shadow. Viper was the leader of a small, brutally efficient team of mercenaries, all former Special Forces operators from various countries. They were Reed's personal fixers, the ones who cleaned up his messes and eliminated his problems. Daniel said he was more than just a thug. He was a professional, a ghost. He never leaves a witness, never leaves a trace. He's disciplined, intelligent, and completely without a soul. He enjoys his work. She paused, wrapping her arms around herself as if fighting off a chill. Daniel managed to get a source inside Reed's security team. The source gave him a name, a call sign they used for Viper on the comms, sometimes after the fanatical monk in that old book. They called him Silas. Jack froze, the coffee mug in his hand stopped halfway to his lips. Silas. The name echoed in the deepest, most haunted chamber of his mind. After the accident that had killed Rebecca and Sophia, the official police report had been thick and inconclusive, a multi-car pileup on a rain-slicked night. But one of the investigating state troopers, an old acquaintance, had pulled Jack aside weeks later. He had spoken in low, unofficial tones about inconsistencies, about a professional-grade driver who had caused the initial crash and then simply vanished from the scene, their vehicle never found. He had mentioned whispers he had heard from federal contacts about a highly skilled fixer who sometimes used the call sign Silas. At the time, it had been a ghost story, a loose thread in a tapestry of grief and confusion. Jack had buried it along with everything else. Now the ghost had a face. Jack, Lisa asked, seeing the color drain from his face. "What is it?" He looked at her, but he didn't truly see her. He saw the mangled wreckage on a dark highway. He saw the flashing red and blue lights painting the trees. He saw the face of the man who had taken everything from him. And he now knew that man had a name. The accident that had shattered his life had been no accident at all. It was a... And Viper was the man who had done it. The war had not just come to find him, it had been with him all along. The name hung in the air between them, a venomous, invisible thing. Viper. For Jack Reynolds, the world had just shrunk to the size of that single name. The vast, indifferent wilderness outside the 6 years of self-imposed exile, the quiet, aching grief, it all collapsed into one sharp, terrifying point of focus. The man who had hunted Daniel Mitchell was the same man who had shattered his own life. It was not a coincidence. It was a reckoning. Lisa saw the transformation in his eyes. The weary sadness she had seen earlier was gone, replaced by something colder, harder. It was a look she had seen once before in the eyes of her husband when he spoke of the things he'd had to do in the war. It was the look of a man who had made peace with violence and was now calling it back to him like an old friend. Before either of them could speak again, the deciding sound came not from a man, but from the animal by the hearth. Ghost, who had been resting quietly, suddenly lifted his head. His ears swiveled, tuning to a frequency beyond human hearing. A low growl like the first rumbling of an earthquake vibrated deep in his chest. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, the pain from his wounds seemingly forgotten. He padded silently to the large window. His powerful body tensed, his gaze fixed not on the ground below, but on the sky above. "What is it?" Lisa whispered, her hand instinctively going to her son's shoulder. Tyler remained asleep in the armchair, oblivious. Jack didn't answer. He trusted the dog's instincts implicitly. He grabbed the pair of high-powered binoculars from the mantelpiece and moved to stand beside Ghost, matching his line of sight. At first, he saw nothing but the vast, empty canvas of the afternoon sky, streaked with high, thin clouds. He scanned the horizon methodically from left to right, his movements economical and precise. He swept past a lone hawk circling on a thermal. Nothing. He was about to lower the binoculars when he caught it, a flicker of unnatural movement. He focused the lenses, his knuckles white. There, high above the opposite ridge, was a tiny black speck. It wasn't a bird. It moved with the smooth, geometric precision of a machine, cutting a slow, deliberate grid pattern across the valley. A drone. A scout. "They've found us," Jack said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The time for grief was over. The time for reaction had begun. He turned from the window, and the grieving recluse was gone. In his place stood Lieutenant Reynolds of the United States Navy SEALs. His movements became sharp, economical, each one with a clear purpose. "Lisa," he said, his tone calm and authoritative, commanding attention without raising his voice. "Listen to me carefully. I need you to take Tyler into the back bedroom. There's a heavy oak dresser against the far wall. Help me move it in front of the window. Stay in that room and stay low. No matter what you hear, you do not come out until I tell you it's safe. Do you understand?" She stared at him, her fear palpable, but she saw the unwavering resolve in his eyes and nodded. "Yes." Together, they moved a heavy piece of furniture blocking the bedroom's only window. He gave her a canteen of water and a loaded pistol. He showed her how to work the safety. Only as a last resort, he instructed. She nodded again, her face pale, but her hands steady as she took the weapon. With Lisa and Tyler secured, Jack began to turn his home into a fortress. He moved with a startling efficiency, a grim dance of preparation. He dragged the heavy wooden dining table and bolted it against the front door, reinforcing it. He locked down the main room's large windows with heavy storm shutters he'd built for the winter, leaving only tiny horizontal slits, firing ports that would allow him to see out without being seen. He went to the large footlocker at the end of his bed and opened it. He pulled out his rifle, a military-grade M4A1 carbine, and several magazines of ammunition. He checked the action, the familiar metallic click, a grimly satisfying sound in the quiet cabin. He laid the magazines out on the mantelpiece within easy reach of the main window. He placed his own pistol on the small table by his armchair. He was a man preparing for a siege, not with panic, but with the methodical precision of a craftsman laying out his tools. Finally, when every physical preparation was complete, he retrieved the last tool from the very bottom of the locker. Wrapped in oilcloth was an old satellite phone. It was a relic from a past life, a piece of gear he had never expected to use again. He took it out onto the porch, seeking a clear line of sight to the sky. Ghost followed, a silent gray and white shadow at his side. The dog sat at the edge of the porch, his gaze sweeping the tree line, a vigilant sentry. Jack powered on the phone, the electronic beep sounding alien in the natural silence. It took a moment to acquire a signal. He dialed a number from memory. It rang twice before a man's voice, calm and steady, answered. Townsend, Townsend. Reynolds here, Jack said, his voice low and even. He knew this call could be monitored. Sheriff Mike Townsend was a good man, a friend from before the accident. He was a stocky, gray-haired lawman who understood the value of leaving a man to his privacy, but Jack knew his loyalty was absolute. Jack, it's been a while. Everything all right up there? There's a possibility of a bad snowstorm moving in, Jack said, the code words feeling strange on his tongue. Could get loud up here. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Townsend was sharp. He understood this was no weather report. How bad are we talking? The kind that closes roads, Jack replied. Listen, I sent you a set of coordinates a few years back for a new hunting blind. You still have them? Got them filed away. Townsend confirmed, his voice now a little tighter. Good. If you get a single word text message from me, Avalanche, I need you to bring your best team to those coordinates. Come in from the East Ridge and come quiet. No lights, no sirens. And Townsend, don't ask any questions over the radio. The silence on the other end was heavy with unspoken questions, but Jack knew his friend would trust him. Understood, Jack Townsend said finally. Stay safe. You too, Jack said, and ended the call. He had planted the seed. He had laid out his contingency. It was all he could do. He looked out at the vast, beautiful, and dangerous wilderness surrounding him. The sun was beginning to dip below the peaks, painting the clouds in shades of orange and blood red. The first shadow had passed. Now all they could do was wait for the darkness to come and for the monsters that moved within it. Night fell not with a gentle fade, but like a heavy black curtain dropped over the mountains. The world outside the cabin was reduced to sound and shadow. The whisper of the wind in the pines, the distant hoot of an owl, and the nervous rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. Inside, the silence was of a different kind. It was thick and heavy, charged with the electric tension of waiting. Jack Reynolds stood by the main window, a motionless silhouette against the faint glow of the dying fire. He peered through the narrow slit in the shutters, his eyes scanning the moon-dappled darkness. Every nerve was alight, every sense tuned to the hostile quiet. He was a sentry on a wall guarding the last outpost of a world that had shrunk to the space of a single room. Across the cabin, Lisa sat at the small table, her hands wrapped around a long, cold mug of coffee. She was trying to be strong, her back straight, her expression composed, but her knuckles were white, and her gaze kept flitting towards the barricaded door. She was a civilian caught in a soldier's war, and her fear was a palpable presence in the room. In the large armchair, Tyler remained a small, still island of trauma. He was curled into a tight ball, his face turned away from the room, his small shoulders rigid. He had not moved for hours, lost in a silent, colorless world that no one could enter. It was Ghost who broke the stalemate. The great dog had been lying near the hearth, a living, breathing shadow, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight. He seemed to understand the heavy weight of the waiting. With a soft groan, he pushed himself to his feet, ignoring his own pain. He padded silently across the floor, not to Jack at his post or to Lisa at the table, but to the armchair. He did not bark or whine or nudge. He simply lay down on the floor beside the chair, his body a solid, warm wall of fur and muscle. He rested his great head on his paws, facing the door as if to say, I will watch over you. He offered no demands, only a steady, quiet presence. He was an anchor in a sea of fear. For a long time, nothing happened. Then from the small figure in the chair, a tiny hand emerged. It hovered in the air for a moment, trembling slightly before slowly descending. Tyler's fingers gently, hesitantly made contact with the thick fur on Ghost's back. The dog did not flinch. He let out a soft sigh, a puff of warm air, and leaned into the touch almost imperceptibly. Jack watched the scene from the corner of his eye, his own breathing hitched. It was the first voluntary movement he had seen the boy make, the first sign of a connection to the world outside his own silent prison. Tyler's hand began to move, stroking the dog's fur in a slow, rhythmic motion. He uncurled himself slightly, leaning over the arm of the chair to get a better look at his new guardian. His eyes, so long vacant, now held a flicker of focus. They traced the lines of the Bucky's powerful body until they rested on the white bandages wrapped around his torso. He saw a small, dark spot where a little blood had seeped through the dressing. The boy's expression shifted. The blankness was replaced by a look of deep, childlike concern. He slid out of the chair, his movements still tentative. He went to the small basin of water on the hearth where Lisa had left a cloth. He picked up the cloth, dipped a corner into the cool water, and carefully wrung it out his small hands, mimicking an action he must have seen 100 times. He returned to Ghost's side. The dog watched him, his tail giving a single slow thump against the floorboards. Tyler knelt and with a touch as gentle as falling snow began to dab at the stained bandage, cleaning the tiny spot of blood away. He was not just petting a dog, he was caring for a fellow patient. He was trying to fix something that was broken. Jack felt a sudden sharp ache in his chest, so intense it almost brought him to his knees. He turned fully from the window, the threat outside momentarily forgotten, and watched the silent boy gently tending to the wounded dog. The image was a key unlocking a door in his memory that he had kept bolted shut for 6 years. He saw not Tyler, but his own daughter, Sophia. He saw her at age 6, her hands just as small, just as gentle as she tried to put a bandage on the scraped knee of her favorite teddy bear. He remembered her boundless, innocent compassion, the way she would rescue earthworms from the hot pavement after a rainstorm, the soft humming sound she would make when she was concentrating on an act of kindness. He saw her spirit, her pure and gentle heart, living in the quiet, careful movements of this broken little boy. The ice that had encased his heart for 2,190 days began to crack. His grief for so long a source of isolating, numbing pain transformed. It was no longer just a ghost to be endured. It became a fire. This was not about revenge for a man named Daniel Mitchell, a brother he had lost touch with. It was not even about settling a score with the phantom named Viper who haunted his past. It was about the small, fragile flicker of life right here, right now in his cabin. It was about this silent boy who was finding his way back to the world through an act of kindness. It was about this brave boy who had carried a message of hope through a storm of violence. It was about this terrified woman who was fighting to hold the pieces of her life together. He looked at Tyler carefully folding the cloth, his task complete. He looked at Ghost, who rested his head on the boy's lap in a gesture of absolute trust. He looked at Lisa, who watched her son with tears of sorrow and gratitude silently streaming down her face. A family. A broken, terrified, makeshift family huddled together in his fortress of solitude. His reason for fighting was no longer behind him, buried in the cold ground of the past. It was here now, breathing the same tense air he was. He was fighting to protect the future, a fragile and uncertain thing that was curled up by his fire. The hours after midnight were the darkest and the quietest. Inside the cabin, a fragile sense of normality had settled. Lisa had finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, her head resting on the table. In the armchair, Tyler slept soundly for the first time in days, his small hand still resting on Ghost's back. The dog lay beside him, a vigilant, living blanket. Only Jack Reynolds remained awake, a ghost at the window, his world compressed to the narrow moonlit slice of forest visible through the shutter. The attack, when it came, did not start with a bang. It began with a whisper. Ghost's head lifted from his paws, a silent movement that screamed alarm. The low rumble started deep in his chest, a sound of pure menace that was nothing like his earlier growls. His lips peeled back from his teeth, and the fur along his spine bristled. His gaze was locked on the dark expanse of trees to the northwest. Jack trusted the dog more than he trusted his own eyes. He raised his rifle, the night vision scope turning the world into a sea of ethereal green. He followed Ghost's line of sight, scanning the dense undergrowth. At first, he saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement, a shadow detaching itself from another shadow. There were 3 of them moving with the fluid, predatory grace of professionals. They were clad in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas. They carried short-barreled rifles with suppressors, the weapons held at the ready. They communicated with silent, efficient hand signals, fanning out to form a perimeter. This was Viper's team. They were not here to negotiate. Jack's heart hammered a slow, cold rhythm in his chest. He was outmanned, outgunned, but this was his mountain. He had the advantage of terrain and preparation. He let them come closer, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He watched as the point man moved past a large oak tree, his boots snagging on a thin, almost invisible wire. Clang, clang, clang. The sound of the string of empty tin cans rattling in the dead quiet night was as loud as a gunshot. The effect was immediate. The 3 figures froze their training, momentarily overridden by surprise. It was the opening Jack needed. He sighted on the lead figure and squeezed the trigger. His rifle, unlike theirs, was not suppressed. The crack of the shot was a deafening roar that shattered the silence, a declaration of war. The lead mercenary crumpled to the ground. The other two instantly returned fire, their suppressed weapons making sharp, angry sounds as bullets thudded into the thick log walls of the cabin. The siege had begun. "Lisa, get down!" Jack yelled, his voice a commanding bark that cut through the noise. He dropped below the window as a hail of bullets stitched across the shutters, wood splintering. In the back room, Lisa was instantly awake, pulling a terrified but still silent Tyler from the chair and onto the floor behind the heavy oak dresser. Jack crawled on his belly to a second firing port on the opposite side of the room. The enemy was smart. While two men laid down covering fire on his last known position, a third was already flanking, trying to get an angle on the back of the cabin. But Ghost was ahead of them. The dog was now at the rear window, his barks sharp and furious, a living alarm system pointing Jack exactly where to look. Jack sighted through the rear slit. He saw the flanking mercenary just as he was about to dash from the cover of a granite boulder. Jack fired two quick shots. The man cried out and scrambled back behind the rock, his advance halted. The fight settled into a deadly rhythm. They were professionals, methodically testing his defenses, firing from different positions, trying to draw his attention and create an opening. But Jack was a master of defense. He moved constantly between his prepared positions, firing only one or two shots from each before relocating. He made it impossible for them to pinpoint his location, creating the illusion that they might be facing more than one defender. He was a ghost in his own home, his movements precise and deadly. Ghost was his second set of eyes and ears. The dog's senses were far superior to his own. A low growl to his left, and Jack would shift to cover the western approach. A sharp bark directed at the stone chimney, and Jack knew they were considering the roof. He and the Bond worked in perfect unspoken sync, a two-man unit forged in the crucible of battle, one man's skill and training, one dog's loyalty, and preternatural senses holding back the tide of darkness. But he knew it couldn't last. They were patient. They would wear him down. They had more men, more ammunition. He saw more shadows moving at the edge of the woods, reinforcing the initial team. They were tightening the net. His contingency plan, his call to Townsend, was his only true hope. But to make that call, he needed a window of opportunity, a few seconds of quiet in the middle of the storm. The opportunity came from an act of aggression. Two mercenaries coordinated a charge on the front porch, laying down a heavy curtain of fire to cover their advance. Jack was pinned down at a side window. He watched them get closer, readying himself for a close-quarters fight he was unlikely to win. Suddenly, Ghost, in a surge of protective fury, launched himself at the main window's shuttered opening, barking and snarling with such ferocity that the mercenaries hesitated for a split second, momentarily believing a second defender was stationed there. It was the break Jack needed. He scrambled away from his position, grabbing the satellite phone from his pack, which he had placed near the hearth. He dove behind the heavy overturned table as bullets ripped through the space he had just occupied. His fingers flew across the keypad, his training allowing him to operate by touch alone. He typed the single prearranged word, avalanche. He hit send. The screen flashed a confirmation message sent. Just as the confirmation appeared, a heavy round smashed through the shutter, showering him with splinters. The mercenaries were renewing their attack, their brief hesitation over. Jack dropped the phone and grabbed his rifle, rolling back into a firing position. The signal was sent. The request for aid was out, but help was miles and precious minutes away. The night was still long and the enemy was at his door. The battle for the cabin, for their lives, was far from over. The silence that followed the first assault was more terrifying than the noise. It was a listening silence, a predator's pause. Outside in the darkness, Jack Reynolds knew the enemy was regrouping, assessing and preparing to come again harder this time. The air in the cabin was thick with the acrid smell of cordite and splintered pine. He moved quickly, reloading his magazines, his hands steady despite the adrenaline that coursed through his veins. Every second of this quiet was a gift, but he knew it was a gift that would soon be taken away. They were trapped. The message was sent, but the mountain was vast and help was far away. If they didn't survive until Townsend's team arrived, their deaths would be just another mystery, another tragedy swallowed by the wilderness. The proof, the entire reason for Daniel's sacrifice, remained locked away on the small piece of plastic and metal on the table. Frustration and despair began to eat at the edges of his control. He stared at the encrypted USB drive with a feeling of utter helplessness. Lisa sat on the floor in the back room holding her sleeping son. The terror of the attack had subsided into a state of numb, hopeless dread. Her mind, seeking an escape, drifted back to the last good day she'd had with Daniel just before he left on his final trip. They had been walking by the river near their home. He had been quiet, his mind clearly elsewhere. She had asked him what was wrong. He had just held her close and said something strange, something she had dismissed at the time as poetic nonsense. Now, in the suffocating quiet of the besieged cabin, the words came back to her with a sudden, startling clarity. "If anything happens," she whispered the words barely audible. "If the worst comes, remember Rebecca's lullaby on the river." Jack, who was checking the barricade on the front door, froze. He turned slowly, his gray eyes locking onto hers. To her, it was a fragment of a memory, a husband's cryptic goodbye. To Jack, it was a key. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "It's just something Daniel said." She stammered, confused by his reaction. "It doesn't mean anything." "Say it again." Exactly as he said it. He said, "Remember Rebecca's lullaby on the river." Jack stared at her, his mind racing, connecting dots that had been invisible moments before. It wasn't a romantic phrase. It was a failsafe. It was a password protocol designed by one Marine for another, a code built not on algorithms, but on shared history and unbreakable trust. Rebecca, his wife's name. A lullaby, a song, a simple melody. The river, a location. That's it, he breathed, a surge of adrenaline hitting him this time, born not of fear but of hope. He grabbed the laptop from the floor. "That's the key." He sat at the table, his movements urgent. Lisa came to stand behind him, her eyes wide with a dawning, fragile hope. He inserted the USB drive again, the familiar password prompt appearing on the screen. "Daniel knew your wife's name was Rebecca," Lisa said, understanding, beginning to piece itself together. "He was the best man at our wedding," as Jack confirmed, his focus entirely on the screen. He typed the first part of the key, REBECCA, the river, he murmured, his mind casting back through the years. There were 100 rivers, 1,000 memories, but only one that mattered to the Shenandoah River. A specific bend in the water just outside of Asheville, where he and Rebecca had gone on their first real date in the summer of '98. A place so significant to them that Daniel was the only other person on Earth who knew its story. He pulled up an offline topographical map he had saved on his hard drive. His fingers moved quickly over the trackpad, zooming in his memory, guiding him with perfect precision. He found the spot. He read the grid coordinates, a long string of numbers. He returned to the password prompt. After Rebecca, he carefully typed the numbers, 38.9072, 78.3209. His finger hovered over the enter key. This was it. The entire war, Daniel's death, their survival, all of it came down to this single desperate guess built on a foundation of memory and loss. He pressed the key. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then the password box vanished. A single folder icon appeared on the screen labeled Insurance. A choked sob escaped Lisa's lips. Jack felt a wave of dizzying relief, but it was instantly followed by a cold dread. They had unlocked the door. Now they had to face what was inside. He clicked on the folder. It was filled with dozens of meticulously organized files. Spreadsheets detailed offshore bank accounts. Encrypted documents outlined shipping routes. Audio files contained secretly recorded conversations. It was Maxwell Reed's entire criminal empire, a monument to greed and cruelty. But one file had a simple, chilling name, the date of Daniel's death. It was a video file. With a deep breath, Jack double-clicked it. The screen filled with a familiar, slightly distorted view from a car's dash cam. It was Daniel's car. They were watching the last moments of his life. They saw a peaceful country road, the sun filtering through the trees. Then a black SUV pulling out aggressively, blocking the way. Daniel's surprise curse. Then the driver's side door of the SUV opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in tactical gear, and moved with an efficient, predatory confidence. It was Viper. The video was high definition, his face clear and unmistakable in the afternoon light. He raised his rifle. The screen flashed with the muzzle blast, the sound a deafening crack. The view from the camera slumped sideways as Daniel was thrown against the passenger seat. The video ended. A profound, horrified silence filled the cabin. Lisa was weeping, her hands covering her mouth, her body shaking with a grief so raw it was painful to witness. But it was the small, silent figure in the corner who provided the final damning testimony. Tyler, awakened by the sound of his mother's cries, had padded out from the back room. He had been drawn by the flickering light of the laptop. He had seen the last few seconds of the video. He had seen the face of the man. The boy made a sound, the first he had made in 2 days. It was a choked, strangled gasp, sound of pure terror. He recoiled as if he had been physically struck, his body trembling violently. He stared at the frozen image of Viper on the screen, his eyes wide with a recognition that went beyond simple fear. It was the absolute certainty of a witness. He lifted a small, shaking hand and pointed a finger at the face of his father's killer. He didn't need to say a word. His silence screamed the truth. Jack continued to methodically examine the files, each one a piece of the puzzle that revealed the true scope of Reed's operation. The logistics software that powered his global shipping empire contained hidden protocols backdoors that allowed specific containers to bypass normal security checks. These containers, labeled as agricultural products or manufactured goods, actually carried human cargo trafficking victims bound for buyers across the globe. Reed's company, Maxwell Logistics, maintained a sophisticated network of offshore accounts to process payments and launder the profits. One spreadsheet listed transactions totaling over $300 million in the past year alone. Another document detailed bribes to port authorities and border officials in 12 countries. But the most damning evidence was a subfolder labeled Cleanup. Inside were detailed reports of problems that had been resolved, people who had gotten too close to the truth and paid with their lives. Each report was clinical, precise, as if documenting nothing more significant than routine maintenance. As Jack scrolled through the list of names, his heart stopped. There, dated October 15, 2019, was an entry: Reynolds R. Vehicular incident, Blue Ridge Parkway, mile marker 423, secondary Reynolds S. Unavoidable collateral. His vision blurred. The world tilted on its axis. He stared at the name of his wife and the coldly technical term applied to his daughter, collateral. They had murdered his family and reduced it to a line item in a spreadsheet. Lisa, who had been reading over his shoulder, placed a gentle hand on his arm. The touch pulled him back from the abyss of rage that threatened to consume him. There was one more file he needed to see. He clicked on an attachment to the Reynolds entry. It opened to reveal an email exchange between Reed and Viper. Reed's message was short: "The ADA is becoming problematic. Her investigation into our Gulf Coast operation is getting too close. Handle it cleanly like the others." Viper's response was equally terse. "Surveillance confirms daily route. Will stage accident at the curve near mile marker 423. Heavy rain forecast provides optimal conditions. No witnesses expected." Jack closed the laptop, his movements deliberate, as if handling something radioactive. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. Rebecca, as an assistant district attorney, had been investigating a case that led back to Reed's trafficking operation. She had gotten too close, and Reed had ordered her death. Sophia had simply been there, an unavoidable collateral. It had never been an accident. It had been an execution, cold and calculated. He looked up at Lisa, who was watching him with a mixture of horror and sympathy. "They killed my family," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. Rebecca was investigating something connected to Reed's operation. "They made it look like an accident. My daughter was just there." She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "It's the same man, Jack. The same man who killed Daniel. The same man who tried to kill us." Jack nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. The coincidence was too perfect, too symmetrical, to be random chance. The universe had conspired to bring the architect of his suffering back into his life, delivering the truth directly to his door. Outside in the cold mountain darkness, Viper was losing his patience. This was supposed to be a simple surgical cleanup: one man, a woman, and a child. But the solitary man in the cabin fought with the skill and tenacity of an entire fire team. They were professionals equipped with superior numbers and technology, yet they were being held at bay by a ghost on a mountain. The prolonged failure was an insult to Viper's arrogance. "Enough of this," he snarled into his comms unit. "All teams suppress the main cabin. Rhino breached the west wall on my signal. We're going in. I'll handle the target myself." Just as he gave the order, Ghost's head snapped it up again. His ears pricked forward, his body tense like a coiled spring. He let out a low, continuous growl that seemed to come from the very depths of his being. Jack moved to the window. Through his night vision scope, he could see them regrouping, 5 men now spread out in a semicircle around the cabin's front and western flank. He counted weapons: 2 suppressed HK-416s, a compact PDW, and something larger carried by the hulking figure they'd called Rhino. A breaching charge. They were going to blow a hole in his wall. Jack turned to Lisa, who stood frozen in the center of the room. "Take Tyler and get in the bathroom. Get in the cast iron tub and pull the mattress over you. Now." She didn't hesitate, scooping up her son and disappearing into the small bathroom. Jack heard the scrape of the heavy old tub as she pulled it away from the wall to make room for the mattress. The assault, when it came, was an act of pure, overwhelming force. A deafening barrage of automatic fire erupted from the tree line, hammering the cabin from all sides, forcing Jack to take cover. Under the curtain of noise and splintering wood, 2 of Viper's men, one a mountain of a man he had called Rhino, sprinted from the darkness carrying a small, powerful breaching charge. They slapped it against the log wall near a window that had been shattered in the initial attack. Jack, anticipating the move, had positioned himself on the opposite side of the room. He couldn't stop them from placing the charge, but he could be ready for what came after. The explosion was a brutal, concussive blast that ripped a jagged hole in the side of the cabin. Smoke and dust filled the room. Before the echoes had even faded, 2 figures in black tactical gear poured through the opening. Jack met them head-on. The fight was no longer a long-distance duel. It was a desperate, close-quarters brawl. He engaged the first mercenary, his rifle now useless in the confined space. He drove the butt of the weapon into the man's solar plexus, doubling him over, then brought his knee up into the exposed face. The second man, Rhino, was massive, at least 6'5", and built like a linebacker. He charged through the smoke, a combat knife gleaming in his fist. Jack pivoted, using the man's momentum against him, sending him crashing into the overturned dining table. But Rhino was fast for his size. He recovered quickly, slashing with the knife in a controlled, practiced arc. Jack felt the blade slice through his shirt sleeve, a line of fire opening across his upper arm. He countered with a sharp elbow strike to Rhino's throat, buying himself a precious second to reach for his own crowbar knife. The 2 men circled each other in the smoky, firelit room, their blades extended, looking for an opening. Rhino lunged, his greater reach a deadly advantage. Jack sidestepped, but the confined space of the cabin limited his movement. The big man pressed his advantage, forcing Jack back step by step. A flicker of movement at the breach caught Jack's attention. A 3rd figure entered the cabin, his movements cool and deliberate amidst the violence. Even in the chaos, Jack recognized him instantly from the video. Viper. Viper dispatched the second man from his team with a sharp, curt order to secure the back room. Then he turned his full attention to Jack. The 2 men circled each other in the poky, firelit room, 2 apex predators meeting for the first time. "You're good," Viper said, his voice a low, calm growl that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "But you're just one man." They collided. It was a fight of savage efficiency, every blow thrown with intent to maim or disable. Jack fought with the desperate strength of a man defending his home and the last flicker of hope in his life. Viper fought with the cold, detached skill of a man for whom violence was simply a tool of his trade. They crashed into furniture, the sounds of their struggle, grunts of pain, the sickening thud of fists on flesh, filling the small cabin. Slowly, inevitably, Viper's superior strength and uninjured state began to win out. He was a machine, relentless and tireless. He caught Jack with a vicious blow to the ribs that sent him stumbling back. Viper followed, tackling him to the ground. The air was driven from Jack's lungs. He saw stars. A combat knife appeared in Viper's hand, the blade gleaming in the firelight. Viper straddled his chest, pressing the point of the knife against his throat. "You've been a problem, Reynolds." Viper sneered, his face inches from Jack's. He had been briefed. He knew who lived here. A cruel, knowing smile spread across his lips. "But you're not the first problem in this family I've had to solve." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a final venomous taunt. "Your wife," she screamed. "Your daughter didn't even make a sound. It was just a quick little bump on the highway. An accident." The words were meant to break him, to shatter his will in the final moments. But they were not the last words spoken in the cabin. From the doorway of the back room, a sound erupted, a sound of pure primal fury that no one could have expected. It was the sound of a voice stolen by trauma being ripped back into the world. Leave him alone. It was Tyler. The boy stood there, his small body trembling, his face pale and tear-streaked. He was staring at Viper, at the monster from his nightmares, and for the first time he was not silent. The shout was a grenade of sound in the tense, violent silence. It shocked Jack, a jolt of pure, protective adrenaline surging through him, but its effect on Viper was even more profound. He was a professional who controlled every variable, and a screaming child was a variable he had not anticipated. For one critical, fatal second, his concentration broke. His head turned instinctively toward the source of the sound, his eyes widening in surprise. That second was all Jack needed. With a roar that came from the deepest part of his soul, he exploded upward. He deflected the knife, the sharp edge slicing a shallow line across his arm. He used Viper's own weight and momentum against him, bucking his hips and rolling them over. The positions were reversed. Jack was now on top, his hands locked around Viper's throat. All his grief, his rage, his love for the family he had lost, and the family he was now protecting, channeled into one final desperate act of survival. Just as he gained control, the world outside the cabin erupted in a flurry of silent, coordinated motion. The remaining mercenaries in the woods were suddenly neutralized, taken down by dark figures that seemed to rise from the very earth. The front door, weakened by the battle, was kicked in. Sheriff Mike Townsend stood there, a shotgun in his hands, flanked by a team of SWAT officers in full tactical gear. They had come from the east. They had come in silence. They had followed the plan, using the GPS coordinates Jack had provided years earlier to locate the cabin deep in the mountains. They swarmed the cabin, their movements professional and swift. The mercenary who had gone to the back room was subdued instantly. Townsend took in the scene, the battered and bleeding Jack, pinning a defeated Viper to the floor, and his expression was a mask of grim understanding. The siege was over. The final battle had been won. From the back room, the sound of a child's voice, no longer screaming in terror, but now crying with relief, echoed through the quiet cabin. The morning after the siege arrived, cold and damp, a heavy mist clinging to the mountainside, obscuring the aftermath of violence. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude, now bore the scars of battle: splintered wood, shattered glass, bullet holes riddling the log walls. Yellow police tape cordoned off the clearing, fluttering in the chill mountain breeze like strange pennants marking contested territory. Inside, Jack Reynolds surveyed the devastation with a soldier's detachment. The home he had built with his own hands now lay in ruins around him. The breach in the western wall gaped like an open wound, hastily covered with a blue tarp that snapped and billowed in the wind. The overturned furniture, the blood-stained floorboards, the spent shell casings glinting in the gray morning light, each a testament to how quickly peace could shatter into chaos. Yet amid the destruction, an unexpected calm had settled over him. For 6 years, he had hidden from the world, believing isolation was the answer to his grief. Now, with the walls of his sanctuary literally broken, he felt something he hadn't expected: relief. The fortress that had protected him had also imprisoned him, keeping him locked in a cycle of mourning that had no end. Through the shattered window, he watched as Lisa sat on the porch steps, a steaming mug clutched between her palms. Tyler was beside her, closer than he had been before, his small shoulder occasionally brushing against his mother's arm, a subtle but significant shift in the boy who had been unreachable just days ago. At their feet lay Ghost, his vigilant amber eyes scanning the tree line, his ears swiveling to catch every sound of the forest awakening. They looked like a family, Jack thought. Wounded, exhausted, but somehow whole in a way he hadn't been since he lost Rebecca and Sophia. A faint vibration disturbed the stillness. Sheriff Townsend's cruiser wound its way up the narrow mountain road, coming to a stop in the clearing. The lawman stepped out, his face grave, as he approached the cabin. Even from a distance, Jack could read the tension in his old friend's shoulders, the heaviness in his step. "You look like a man carrying bad news," Jack said, as Townsend climbed the porch steps. The sheriff removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. "I wish I was bringing better." "We've got a problem, Jack. The evidence on that drive is rock solid. It's enough to put Reed away for multiple lifetimes. But the FBI just informed me that Reed's private jet filed a flight plan late last night. He's gone, flew to a country with no extradition treaty." Jack absorbed the news with a cold certainty. He had expected nothing less from a man like Maxwell Reed, a predator who had survived by anticipating threats and eliminating them before they became dangerous. Viper's failure to silence them had triggered Reed's contingency plan. "What about Viper?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the fury building beneath his calm exterior. Townsend shook his head, his expression darkening. "That's the other problem. He was being transported to a federal holding facility. The convoy was ambushed on Route 29. Professional job, multiple vehicles, precision driving, military-grade weapons. 3 marshals down, 2 critical. And Viper gone. Extracted." The implications settled like lead in Jack's stomach. Reed had resources connections that extended beyond mere wealth. He had an organization capable of executing a high-risk rescue operation against federal authorities. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. "They'll come for us," Jack said, a statement of fact rather than a question. Townsend nodded grimly. "That's why I'm here. U.S. Marshals are setting up a safe house for Mrs. Mitchell and her son, witness protection. They'll be moved today." Jack glanced back at Lisa and Tyler on the porch at Ghost lying protectively at their feet. They had found a fragile peace in the aftermath of violence. Now they would be uprooted again, hidden away in some anonymous suburban house, always looking over their shoulders, always waiting for the danger to find them. What about him? Lisa's voice cut through his thoughts as she approached, having overheard enough to understand what was happening. Her hand instinctively went to Tyler's shoulder, pulling him closer to her side. "Jack goes with us." "Right?" Townsend's silence was answer enough. "The Marshal Service doesn't have authorization to protect him. He's not a direct witness to Reed's operation. Technically, he's just a civilian who got caught in the crossfire." Lisa's face hardened, a flash of the same determination that had kept her and Tyler alive in the days after Daniel's murder. "No, we're not separating. We stay together." The sheriff looked torn, caught between protocol and what he knew was right. "I might be able to pull some strings, but it would take time, days, maybe weeks. And we need to move you now." A third option formed in Jack's mind, crystallizing with sudden clarity. He studied the faces before him. Lisa's fierce protectiveness, Tyler's quiet trust, Townsend's conflicted loyalty. He knew what needed to be done. It went against every instinct of self-preservation he had cultivated in his years of isolation, but he also recognized it as the only path forward. "There's another way," he said quietly. "We don't hide. We hunt." The words hung in the cold mountain air, bold and dangerous. Townsend stared at him in disbelief. "You want to go after Reed, a billionaire with private security, political connections, and now international protection? That's suicide, Jack. Not suicide, strategy." Jack moved toward the cabin door, gesturing for them to follow. Inside, he retrieved his laptop and placed it on the kitchen counter, the only surface still intact after the battle. What Reed doesn't know is that Daniel built a backdoor into the evidence. He opened a hidden subfolder on the USB drive, revealing a series of files Daniel had encrypted separately from the main cache. It was data that even Reed didn't know existed: surveillance of Reed's personal security protocols, the layouts of his homes, the schedules of his private jets, the identities of his security personnel. Daniel had been thorough mapping not just Reed's criminal empire, but the man himself. Daniel knew Reed would run if exposed. Jack explained, his finger tapping the screen, where a detailed map of a coastal compound appeared. He prepared for it. "This is Reed's exit strategy, a private estate in a remote location beyond U.S. jurisdiction. It's where he'll go to ground while his lawyers and fixers try to contain the damage." "You're talking about crossing international borders to pursue a fugitive." Townsend pointed out, his law enforcement instincts warring with his personal feelings. "That's not just illegal, it's practically an act of war. I'm talking about finishing what Daniel started." Jack countered, his voice level but intense. "Reed has killed dozens of people, including my family and Daniel. He's trafficked hundreds more. And now he's escaped justice because he's rich enough to buy his way out. The system failed. We won't." Lisa stepped forward, her eyes moving from the laptop screen to Jack's face. Her expression shifted from uncertainty to resolve. "Daniel would have wanted this. He died trying to expose Reed. If we hide, if we just disappear into witness protection, everything he sacrificed will have been for nothing." Townsend looked between them, his face a study in conflicting loyalties. After a long moment, he let out a heavy sigh. "I can't be part of this, officially. You understand that, right?" As far as the record shows, Lisa and Tyler Mitchell entered witness protection today. I can give you a 3-day head start before anyone realizes you've gone off-grid. After that, you're on your own. Jack nodded, understanding the enormous risk Townsend was taking with his career, possibly his freedom. The bond between them, forged in the quiet mountains years ago and tempered in the fire of last night's battle, was stronger than any badge or oath of office. With the decision made, they moved with purpose. Jack retrieved his footlocker from beneath the floorboards, revealing the tools of his former life: weapons, tactical gear, communication devices, and identification documents he had never expected to use again. Among them was a satellite phone with an encrypted line, a relic from his SEAL days. He pressed a sequence of numbers from memory, a code that would reach out to ghosts from his past. The call connected, silence on the other end. Jack spoke a single phrase, words that would identify him to men who operated in shadows: Sierra Echo Alpha Lima, Nomad, Sanctuary Breach, request assistance. There was a pause, then a terse response: location and timetable. He provided coordinates for a rendezvous point, a time frame of 48 hours. The call ended without confirmation, but Jack knew help would be waiting. In his former life, such codes were sacred, transcending time and distance, binding men who had fought and bled together. While Jack mobilized his resources, Lisa packed essentials for herself and Tyler: clothes, medications, a few treasured photos that had survived their flight from home. The boy, still largely silent but more present than before, watched the preparations with solemn attention. He remained close to Ghost, his small hand never straying far from the dog's fur. By midday, the cabin was transformed from battlefield to staging ground. Maps covered the kitchen table, marked with transit routes and contingency plans. Weapons were cleaned, checked, and secured for travel. Supplies were packed with military precision, everything necessary, nothing superfluous. As evening approached, Jack stepped onto the porch for a final look at the mountain that had been his refuge and prison for 6 years. The setting sun painted the ridges in gold and crimson, the beauty untouched by the human drama unfolding in its shadow. He had come here to escape the world, to bury his grief in isolation. Now he was leaving to confront that grief head-on, to seek not just vengeance, but justice. Lisa joined him, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "The mountains will still be here," she said softly, reading his thoughts with surprising accuracy. "When this is over." Jack nodded, allowing himself to imagine a future beyond the mission, beyond the all-consuming focus on Reed. It was a dangerous luxury for a soldier, but one he permitted himself briefly. Yes, he agreed, they will. They departed before dawn, traveling in Townsend's personal vehicle to avoid official channels. The sheriff drove them to a small, private airstrip tucked between two mountain ridges, where a nondescript twin-engine plane waited on the tarmac. The pilot, a weathered man with the quiet competence of someone accustomed to asking no questions, loaded their gear without comment. As they prepared to board, Townsend pulled Jack aside, pressing a satellite phone into his hand. "For emergencies only," he instructed. "It's untraceable, but assume any communication is compromised. You need to disappear, Jack. Completely." Jack gripped his friend's shoulder, an unspoken thank you for risks taken and rules bent. They both understood this might be the last time they saw each other. "If I don't make it back," Townsend cut him off with a firm shake of his head. "You will. And when you do, we'll have a conversation about what comes next. There's a place for a man with your skills even after all these years." The implication was clear: a path back to a life of service, a purpose beyond vengeance. Jack nodded, tucking the possibility away for a future that remained uncertain. The plane lifted off as the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern ridges, banking north before turning west to mask their true destination. In the cabin, Tyler sat by the window, Ghost's head resting on his lap. The boy's eyes were fixed on the diminishing mountains, watching as the only safety he had known since his father's death receded into the distance. Lisa leaned close to Jack, her voice pitched low to avoid disturbing her son. "Are we doing the right thing? Taking him into danger instead of letting him be safe?" Jack studied the boy and the dog, the unlikely bond formed in trauma and strengthened in survival. "There are different kinds of safety," he replied after a moment. "The kind that hides you away, keeps you isolated, protected, but never healing. I tried that. For 6 years. It nearly killed me, just slower than a bullet would have." His gaze moved from Tyler to Lisa, seeing in her eyes the same courage that had driven Daniel to pursue the truth regardless of the cost. And there's the safety that comes from confronting what haunts you, from bringing the darkness into the light where it can't grow stronger. That's what we're giving him the chance to see the monster defeated, not just hidden from. Lisa nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her expression. Like you with Viper. Jack felt a chill at the name, at the memory of the man's face so close to his own, taunting him with the details of his family's murder. Yes, he acknowledged. Exactly like that. The plane touched down 14 hours later at a small airstrip in Montana, the vastness of the Big Sky country stretching in all directions. A battered Land Rover waited near the hangar, keys left in the ignition as arranged. They transferred their gear, quickly aware that each moment in the open increased their exposure. Jack drove west into the gathering darkness, following unmarked roads that wound through dense forests and across empty stretches of rangeland. The rendezvous point was a hunting cabin deep in the national forest, isolated enough to provide security, but accessible to those who knew where to look. They arrived just after midnight, the cabin dark and seemingly deserted. Jack approached cautiously, signaling for Lisa and Tyler to remain in the vehicle with Ghost. He circled the perimeter, once noting the fresh boot prints in the soft earth, the recently disturbed branches that created a natural alarm system around the clearing. The cabin door opened before he reached it. A silhouette filled the frame, backlit by the soft glow of a kerosene lamp. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, his posture unmistakably military despite the civilian clothes. "You look like hell, Reynolds," the man said, stepping aside to let Jack enter. "Still better than you, Torres." Jack replied, the familiar exchange bringing a rush of memory. Desert operations, midnight raids, the bone-deep trust that comes only from facing death together. Inside, two more men waited, their faces weathered by time and hard experience, but instantly recognizable to Jack. Mason and Cooper, former teammates from his SEAL unit, men he had fought beside in another lifetime. They greeted him with the understated warmth of warriors reunited, clasping forearms instead of hands, eyes communicating what words couldn't express. When Jack signaled the all clear, Lisa and Tyler approached, with Ghost padding silently beside them. The boy's eyes widened at the sight of the three strangers, his body tensing. The dog sensed his anxiety, positioning himself protectively between Tyler and the unknown men. Torres, the first to grasp the situation, dropped to one knee, bringing himself to Tyler's eye level. "He's quite a dog," he said simply, not reaching toward Ghost, but allowing the animal to assess him. "Military working dog." Jack nodded. He belonged to Daniel Mitchell, Lisa's husband. Understanding passed between the former SEALs. They had all read the briefing Jack had sent ahead, the summary of Reed's crimes, Daniel's murder, the connection to Jack's family, the evidence secured, and the justice denied. Mason stepped forward, extending his hand to Lisa. "Your husband was a brave man, Mrs. Mitchell. What he uncovered, it's bigger than you know. We've been tracking Reed's organization from another angle for years. Daniel's evidence is the missing piece." The revelation shifted the dynamic in the room. This wasn't just about personal vengeance. It was about completing a mission that had been unfolding in the shadows all along. The men Jack had called weren't simply doing him a favor, they were pursuing their own objective. Cooper unrolled a map on the rough-hewn table, weighting the corners with combat knives. "Reed's compound is here," he indicated, pointing to a coastal area. 15 acres private beachfront, surrounded by dense jungle on three sides. The security is extensive: motion sensors, thermal cameras, armed patrols. He's got a private militia of about 20 men, all with special forces backgrounds from various countries. Jack studied the defenses, his mind automatically calculating angles of approach, vulnerabilities, extraction routes. "It's designed to repel a frontal assault," he observed. "But that's not what we're going to do." For the next 2 hours, they developed their strategy. It wasn't a direct attack that would be suicide against Reed's superior numbers and defensive position. Instead, they crafted a plan that would use Reed's own paranoia against him, exploiting the predictable responses of a man who believed himself untouchable. The foundation was simple. Viper's extraction had been too clean, too professional. It suggested inside help, a mole within federal law enforcement. That mole would be monitoring all official channels for any indication that witnesses had survived. They would use this to feed false information, creating the impression that Lisa and Tyler had been killed in a botched witness protection transfer. With Reed believing all loose ends had been eliminated, his security would relax just enough to create an opening. Torres, with his background in intelligence operations, would handle the disinformation campaign. Mason and Cooper would establish surveillance on the compound, mapping guard rotations and identifying the weakness they would exploit. As the planning session wound down, exhaustion finally overtook them. Lisa took Tyler to one of the small bedrooms, Ghost following faithfully. The former SEAL settled into watches the habit of vigilance, never truly abandoned, even years after leaving the service. Jack stepped outside, needing a moment alone to process the rapid escalation of events. The night was clear, the Montana sky ablaze with stars undiminished by artificial light. He found himself searching for the constellations Rebecca had taught him to identify on their early dates: Orion, Cassiopeia, the Pleiades. She had loved the stars, finding in their ancient patterns a reminder that some things endured beyond human suffering. The crunch of boots on gravel announced Torres' approach. The man offered a cigarette, which Jack declined with a shake of his head. Old habits, Torres shrugged, lighting one for himself. The ember glowed in the darkness as he inhaled. "You sure about this, Jack?" he asked after a moment. "Going after Reed isn't like our old operations. There's no government backing, no extraction plan if things go sideways. If we're caught, we're just murderers and kidnappers." Jack considered the question, weighing it against the alternative, watching Lisa and Tyler disappear into witness protection, always running, always hiding, while Reed remained free to continue his operations from a different location. "I'm sure about one thing," he replied finally. "6 years ago, I walked away. I buried myself in those mountains and left the fight to others. Now I know that was a mistake. You don't escape grief by hiding from it. You just give it more power." Torres nodded, understanding the deeper current beneath Jack's words. The mission was about Reed, yes, but it was also about redemption. A chance to confront not just the man who had ordered his family's death, but the failure that had haunted Jack since that rainy night on the Blue Ridge Parkway. The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Cooper departed for the coast to establish advanced surveillance. Mason began processing Daniel's intelligence, cross-referencing it with their own information to build a comprehensive profile of Reed's operation. Torres made a series of calls from untraceable burner phones, setting in motion the disinformation strategy. Lisa immersed herself in the preparations, her determination matching that of the former operators. She studied maps, memorized contingencies, and practiced with the compact 9mm pistol Jack had insisted she carry. Her hands were steady, her eyes focused, a civilian by training, but a warrior by necessity. Tyler remained quiet but watchful, absorbing the activity around him with the intense focus of a child trying to make sense of an adult world. He spent hours with Ghost the dog's presence, seeming to anchor him amid the uncertainty and tension. Occasionally, he would speak brief sentences directed at the ball or single-word responses to direct questions, each utterance a small victory in his battle against trauma. On the third day, Cooper returned with comprehensive surveillance of Reed's compound. The security was formidable but not impenetrable. Reed's confidence in his sanctuary had created predictable patterns, guard changes at regular intervals, consistent patrol routes, designated smoking areas that created momentary blind spots. Most importantly, Cooper had identified Reed's routine. The billionaire spent each morning on his private beach, swimming in the protected cove before returning to the main house for breakfast. It was the one time he was relatively isolated, guarded by only two men who maintained a respectful distance. It was the vulnerability they needed, a 15-minute window where Reed was accessible without the full protection of his security apparatus. With the intelligence gathered and the plan refined, they prepared for deployment. Weapons were checked, communications tested, contingencies reviewed. They would insert by sea, approaching the compound from the one direction Reed's security considered least vulnerable due to the rough coastal waters and jagged rocks. The night before their departure, Jack found Tyler sitting alone on the cabin's small porch, Ghost lying protectively at his feet. The boy was holding something in his hands, a small worn photograph that Jack recognized as one of the few possessions Lisa had brought from their former life. Tyler looked up as Jack approached, his eyes reflecting the same quiet intensity that had characterized his father. "It's Dad," he said, simply turning the photo so Jack could see. It showed Daniel in happier times, his arm around Lisa, Tyler perched on his shoulders, all three smiling at the camera. "He was brave, wasn't he?" Tyler asked, his voice small but steady. Jack settled beside him on the step, choosing his words carefully. "Very brave. He discovered something bad happening to people who couldn't protect themselves. He could have looked away, pretended he didn't see it. That would have been easier, safer. But he didn't. He decided to help them, even though it was dangerous." Tyler considered this, his fingers tracing the outline of his father's face in the photograph. Is that what you're doing now, being brave like Dad? The question caught Jack off guard, its simplicity cutting through the layers of strategy and revenge to the moral core of their mission. Yes, he answered finally. I'm trying to be. Like your dad, like my wife was, too. She was a lawyer who helped people who were hurt by powerful men. That's why the bad men came after her. He paused, realizing he had never spoken so directly about Rebecca to anyone since her death. The words once released seemed to lighten something within him, a burden shared rather than carried alone. Tyler nodded solemnly, processing this connection between his loss and Jack's. After a moment, he asked another question that struck at the heart of Jack's motivation. Will it bring them back if we catch the bad man? Jack felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. No, he admitted softly, it won't bring them back. Nothing can do that, but it will stop him from hurting other families. And maybe it helps us remember them the right way. Not just how they died, but what they lived for. The boy absorbed this, his young face solemn with understanding beyond his years. Then his expression shifted, a flicker of the child he should have been, breaking through the trauma-imposed maturity. Will Ghost come with us to catch the bad man? Jack smiled, reaching out to ruffle the dog's thick fur. Ghost absolutely comes with us. He's part of the team. The answer seemed to satisfy Tyler. He leaned against Jack's side, a tentative gesture of trust that caught Jack by surprise. They sat together in companionable silence. As twilight deepened into night, two souls joined by loss but not defined by it. Dawn broke clear and cold on the day of the operation. They traveled separately to minimize detection, Torres and Mason taking the equipment by road. Jack, Lisa, Tyler, and Ghost flying commercial under false identities to a city 300 miles from Reed's compound. Cooper met them at the airport, driving them to a small coastal town where a fishing boat waited to take them the final stretch. The captain, a weathered man with the 1,000-yard stare of a former combatant, asked no questions as they loaded their gear onto his vessel. Cash had bought his boat and his silence for 24 hours, enough time to insert the team and extract them with their target. As they prepared to depart, Jack took Lisa aside. This is your last chance to reconsider. He told her, his voice low to avoid being overheard by Tyler, who was helping Mason secure their equipment. You and Tyler can still walk away, enter witness protection. What we're about to do, there's no coming back from it. Lisa's eyes hardened, the grief that had shadowed her face since Daniel's death crystallizing into something sharper, more focused. I made my choice when I decided not to run, she replied. Daniel gave his life to expose Reed. I won't hide while his killer walks free. Jack nodded, recognizing in her the same determination that had driven him to this moment. He had expected nothing less, but he needed to offer the choice one final time to be certain they were all committed to the path ahead. The boat slipped from the harbor as the sun dipped toward the horizon, timing their approach to coincide with nightfall. They would anchor in international waters overnight, then make their final approach before dawn, using the gray light of early morning to mask their insertion. Lisa settled Tyler in the small cabin below deck, Ghost curled protectively at the foot of the narrow bunk. The boy was exhausted from the tension and travel, falling asleep almost immediately despite the rolling motion of the vessel. On deck, the former SEALs made final preparations. Weapons were waterproofed, communications checked one last time, routes and contingencies reviewed. They were operating without a safety net beyond the reach of any official support. If something went wrong, there would be no rescue, no extraction, no diplomatic intervention. They were ghosts on a mission that officially did not exist. As darkness fell, Jack stood at the bow, watching the distant lights of the coast blur and fade with the boat's motion. The familiar weight of his tactical gear, the reassuring presence of his teammates, the focused clarity of a mission briefing, all of it awakened muscle memories from his previous life, as if the 6 years of isolation had been nothing more than an extended leave of absence. Yet he was not the same man who had worn the SEAL trident. That man had believed in systems, in the power of organized justice to right the world's wrongs. This man, the one standing on a fishing boat headed toward an unsanctioned operation against a private citizen, understood that some evils existed beyond the reach of conventional justice. The insertion went according to plan, the team surfacing at the precise location Cooper had identified, a small rocky cove sheltered from view by an outcropping of jagged stone. They secured their diving gear and waterproof caches and moved inland through the dense coastal vegetation, avoiding the regular patrol routes Cooper had mapped during his surveillance. They positioned themselves in a blind overlooking the private beach where Reed took his morning swim. The security was exactly as Cooper had described, two guards maintaining a respectful distance while their employer enjoyed his daily ritual. The men were professional, alert but not paranoid, their weapons visible but not at the ready. They believed the threat to their employer had been eliminated with the reported deaths of the Mitchell family. It was the complacency they had counted on. At precisely 7:15 a.m., Maxwell Reed emerged from the main house dressed in a silk robe over swimming trunks. Even from a distance, Jack could see the man's imperious bearing, the unconscious arrogance of someone accustomed to bending the world to his will. This was the architect of so much suffering, the man who had ordered the deaths of Rebecca and Sophia as casually as one might request a coffee. The moment stretched into crystalline clarity for Jack, time seeming to slow as Reed disrobed and waded into the turquoise waters of the cove. This was the culmination of 6 years of grief, of rage suppressed and channeled into isolation. Now finally he was face to face with the source of his pain. The team moved with practiced precision. Torres and Mason neutralizing the guards with tranquilizer darts fired simultaneously from suppressed rifles. The men dropped without a sound, unconscious, before they hit the sand. Cooper secured the perimeter, ensuring no alarm had been raised while Jack and Lisa approached the water's edge. Reed was floating on his back, eyes closed against the rising sun, unaware of the drama unfolding on shore. When he finally turned to return to the beach, he froze, seeing Jack standing at the water's edge, rifle aimed at his chest. For a long moment, confusion dominated Reed's expression, the entitled bewilderment of a man encountering an inconvenience he believed he had paid to eliminate. Then recognition dawned as Lisa stepped forward, her face visible beneath the tactical cap she wore. "You're supposed to be dead," Reed said, his voice carrying across the gentle lapping of waves. "All of you," Viper confirmed. Jack cut him off, his voice cold and precise. "Viper failed, just like he failed 6 years ago when he killed my wife and daughter on your orders. Rebecca Reynolds, Assistant District Attorney, investigating your Gulf Coast operation. Ring any bells?" Reed's expression shifted, calculation replacing confusion as he assessed this new threat. His eyes darted toward the unconscious guards, then back to Jack. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, the smooth denial of a man accustomed to creating his own reality. "But whatever you think I've done, this isn't the way to handle it. I'm a U.S. citizen. I have rights." Jack moved closer to the water's edge, close enough to see the fear beginning to penetrate Reed's practiced calm. "Rights," he repeated the words sharp with contempt. "Like the rights of the people your organization trafficked? Like my wife's right to justice, like Daniel Mitchell's right to expose your crimes?" Lisa stepped forward, her pistol steady in her hand. "We have the evidence, Reed, all of it. The offshore accounts, the shipping manifests, the recordings of you ordering murders. Even if we die here today, that evidence has already been released to every major news organization and law enforcement agency in the world. It was a bluff. The evidence was secure, but not yet distributed." But Reed had no way of knowing that, and the uncertainty shattered his composure. His face contorted with rage, the mask of civilized restraint falling away to reveal the predator beneath. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he snarled, making no move to come out of the water. "I have connections you can't imagine, judges, senators, intelligence directors. This compound isn't even my most secure location. I'll be gone before any authorities can act, and I'll spend the rest of my comfortable life watching you hunted down like dogs." Jack recognized the threat for what it was, the desperate posturing of a cornered animal. But he also knew there was truth behind Reed's boast. The man's wealth and influence extended into places that should have been beyond corruption. It was why conventional justice had failed, why they had been forced to this extreme measure. The mission parameters had been clear from the beginning: capture Reed, transport him to a location where he could be formally turned over to authorities, not compromised by his influence. But standing there facing the architect of so much suffering, Jack felt the pull of a darker alternative. One bullet, one moment of retribution. It would be so simple. As if sensing his thoughts, Lisa placed a hand on his arm. "Not like this, Jack," she said quietly. "Not for revenge, for justice. Daniel gave his life for justice." Her touch anchored him, pulling him back from the precipice of becoming what he hunted. She was right. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about accountability. Reed would face the consequences of his actions, not in the quick release of a bullet, but in the slow, methodical process of justice he had evaded for so long. Out of the water, Jack ordered, gesturing with his rifle. Now, Reed hesitated, perhaps calculating his chances of escape by swimming to deeper water. Then, seeing the implacable determination in Jack's eyes, he waded reluctantly towards shore. As he reached the shallow water, Cooper approached with restraints. The billionaire's wrists were secured behind his back. His protests ignored as he was marched toward the extraction point where their boat waited beyond the coastal patrols. The operation had succeeded. Maxwell Reed, architect of so much suffering, was now in their custody. The long journey toward justice for Daniel, for Rebecca and Sophia, for countless unnamed victims of Reed's trafficking network, had taken its most significant step forward. Yet as Jack watched Reed being led away, he felt not triumph, but a quiet, unexpected peace. The rage that had consumed him for 6 years, that had driven him to isolation, and now to this desperate mission, began to recede like a tide going out. In its place came something he had thought lost: forever hope. Not just for justice, but for healing, for a future beyond grief. He turned to Lisa, seeing in her eyes the same complex mixture of emotions: relief, vindication, and the first tentative recognition that their shared ordeal might finally be ending. They had survived. They had prevailed, and in doing so they had forged a bond that transcended their individual losses. Together they followed the team inland toward the extraction point, leaving behind the beautiful, corrupt sanctuary Reed had built. Ahead lay uncertainty, legal complications, the possibility of prosecution for their extrajudicial action, the challenge of rebuilding lives shattered by violence and loss. But for the first time in 6 years, Jack Reynolds walked toward that uncertainty without fear. Whatever came next, he would face it not as a ghost haunting his own life, but as a man fully present in it, honoring the past without being imprisoned by it, embracing a future he had once believed impossible. The fall of Victor Kane's empire was swift and spectacular. The evidence on the USB drive, which the media quickly dubbed the Mitchell Files, was a digital bombshell. It provided an undeniable roadmap of Reed's entire criminal network, from the shell companies that laundered money to the shipping routes that transported human cargo disguised as agricultural products. Faced with an ironclad case and the prospect of spending the rest of his life in a maximum security prison, Reed broke. Whether motivated by self-preservation or the belated recognition of his own mortality, he confessed to everything, detailing years of criminal activity, including the meticulously planned accident on a rainy night in 2019 that had taken the lives of Rebecca and Sophia Reynolds. The news stories were a firestorm. The philanthropist was revealed to be a monster. The tech mogul was a human trafficker. The name Maxwell Reed became synonymous with evil, and the name Daniel Mitchell was finally celebrated for the hero he was. But for the survivors, the headlines were just distant noise. Their world was the quiet, difficult work of rebuilding. 6 months later, on a clear spring morning, Jack Reynolds stood on the porch of a new cabin built on the same mountainside but in a different clearing. The old cabin, too damaged and too haunted by violence to be salvaged, had been torn down. This one was larger, with more windows to let in the light, more rooms to accommodate a family. From inside came the sound of Lisa's laughter, followed by the higher, clear tones of Tyler's voice. The boy spoke more now, his silence giving way to a cautious but growing engagement with the world. He still had nightmares, still had moments when he retreated into himself, but they were becoming less frequent, less intense. Ghost lay at Jack's feet, his gray and white coat gleaming in the sunlight. The wound on his flank had healed completely, leaving only a small patch of fur that grew in a different direction, a testament to the journey that had brought them all together. The sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Sheriff Townsend's cruiser appeared around the bend in the road, kicking up dust as it approached. The lawman stepped out, a smile breaking across his weathered face as he took in the sight of the new cabin. "Place looks good, Jack," he called as he climbed the porch steps. "You've been busy." Jack nodded, extending his hand. "Good to see you, Mike." Townsend clasped his hand firmly, then pulled him into a brief, rough embrace. They had spoken only rarely in the months since the Reed operation, the sheriff maintaining a professional distance while the legal dust settled. "How's the family?" Townsend asked, nodding toward the cabin door. "They're doing well." Tyler's starting school in the fall. Lisa's talking about teaching again once things settle down. And you, what about you, Jack? Jack considered the question, feeling its weight. For so long, he had defined himself by what he had lost. Husband, father, soldier, all identities torn away in a single moment of violence. Now he was rebuilding not just a cabin, but a sense of self. I'm finding my way, he answered honestly, day by day. Townsend nodded, understanding the deeper current beneath the simple words. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. This came for you. Official channels. Jack took the envelope, recognizing the federal seal in the corner. Inside was a letter on Department of Justice letterhead. He scanned it quickly, his expression revealing nothing. What is it? Townsend asked. A job offer. Jack folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope. They want me to consult on a task force. Human trafficking interdiction. It seems some of Reed's associates are still operating, and they think I might have insights. You going to take it? Jack looked out over the mountains at the endless waves of green rolling toward the horizon. For 6 years, he had hidden among these peaks, believing that isolation was the answer to his pain. Now he knew differently. The mountains would always be there, a refuge when he needed it, but they were not meant to be a prison. I think I might, he said finally. Part-time at least. I've got responsibilities here now. As if on cue, the cabin door opened. Tyler bounded out, Ghost immediately at his side. The boy's face lit up at the sight of the sheriff. Sheriff Townsend, Tyler called, his voice carrying across the clearing. Come see what I built. With a grin, Townsend and let himself be led around the side of the cabin where Tyler had constructed an elaborate fort from fallen branches and old boards. Lisa appeared in the doorway, watching them go with a fond smile. She caught Jack's eye, raising an eyebrow in silent question. He held up the envelope, nodding slightly. They want me back. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Her voice was quiet, meant only for him. What do you want? Jack considered her question, feeling its importance. He had spent 6 years running from the world, and the past few months learning to engage with it again. The process had been difficult, painful at times, but also unexpectedly rewarding. I want to help, he said simply. I want to make a difference, like Daniel did, like Rebecca tried to do. She nodded, her hand finding his. Then that's what you should do. The decision settled between them, unspoken but understood. They were not defined by the tragedy that had brought them together. They were defined by what they chose to do with the life that remained, how they honored the dead, how they protected the living, how they built a future from the broken pieces of the past. As the sun climbed higher over the mountains, Jack Reynolds looked at the family that had found him in his solitude. A brave woman who had faced her worst fears, a resilient boy who was learning to trust again, a loyal dude who had carried hope through a storm of violence. They were all wounded, all healing, all finding their way together. The mountains had not changed. They stood as they always had, ancient and indifferent to human suffering. But Jack had changed. The fortress he had built to keep the world out had become a home to welcome others in. The grief that had driven him to isolation had become a force that connected him to a larger purpose. He was no longer a ghost haunting his own life. He was a guardian standing watch over what mattered most. And in that role, he had found not just purpose, but peace, not the cold, empty silence of isolation, but the warm, living quiet of belonging. The past could not be changed. The dead could not be brought back. But the future was still unwritten, still full of possibility. And for the first time in many years, Jack Reynolds was ready to step into it, no longer alone, no longer afraid, but surrounded by the family he had found in the aftermath of loss. A family forged in fire, tempered by grief and bound together by something stronger than blood. The choice to face the darkness together and to build something new in the light that followed.